Hello everybody! Today I have another replay for you. Now this deck is kind of slow, so I'm only going to show one replay of it, but it should give you a good idea of how it plays and what the game plan is. So this is Voice of Winter Nishaven. Now, Voice of Winter is a 5-cost weapon that freezes any ally that enters play for 2 turns. Or actually, I should say any ally that is summoned, because we can take advantage of the fact that it doesn't freeze stuff that enters play to put out allies that aren't frozen, and then take advantage of that when the opponent has all frozen allies and you have all allies that entered play, essentially. So in this deck, we're using these artifacts that summon themselves and they enter play so that they don't actually get frozen by Voice of Winter. Now, quick note about Thoughtful Investment. Thoughtful Investment is another artifact that takes the top card of your deck and you draw it, and then you put a card from your hand on top of your resource pile. Now, this is really strong on turn 3 to go to 4 resources way before the opponent does. And then you're just always 1 resource ahead when you play this card. It's perfect for a slower deck like this, where we kind of take back control of the board if the opponent takes the board, and we want to have those extra resources. So we run Thoughtful Investment in conjunction with a card called Meltdown, which is also happens to be in our hand, and that really it destroys an item and lets us draw 2 cards. So it works really well with the Thoughtful Investment that is otherwise kind of useless on our board. So here, because we got to 5 resources early, we're able to play Voice of Winter on turn 4. Playing Voice of Winter on turn 4 is a little too fast. I might have been better off holding it, actually, but I felt like it was a good option here. It kind of backfires a little bit because our opponent is playing Ruby Embellished Dagger. Frankly, if they played Wizened Staff, it would have been the same. Any kind of weapon is going to be able to take off durability from Voice of Winter and actually kind of nullify its effect. So our opponent here goes in and removes the durability there, which is very smart. That's what you want to do when you're playing against Voice of Winter decks. You want to get rid of the Voice of Winter as soon as you can through weapons, generally. So here, this is kind of a tricky choice, but because Voice of Winter is so important to this strategy, I'm actually going to go ahead and activate Nishaven's ability here. I don't want to lose any more durability, and I'm fine using Nishaven's ability because I know for a fact that this is going to force my opponent to either use Focus Prayer on Voice of Winter or summon an ally frozen this turn. And so that's why I go ahead and use the Nishaven ability, even though it seems like a huge waste. And actually, let's talk a little bit about Nishaven's ability and why we're running Nishaven. I'm going to try and pause the game. Nishaven has an ability that deals 3 electric damage to all opposing allies, and then deals another 2 electric damage to all opposing allies if any of them were killed. Now, this is really strong with Voice of Winter, because Voice of Winter's weakness is the opponent spamming a bunch of low-cost allies, and then you're never able to play Voice of Winter because of the fact that your opponent can just remove all the durability by attacking into it with all the low-cost allies they have. So Nishaven basically covers this deck's weakness. You can also run this on Eladwin or maybe even some other decks, but I find that Voice of Winter really struggles against those rush decks that summon a ton of low-cost allies, and then you just never have time to play Voice of Winter, and that's why I think that Nishaven really helps and really suits this kind of deck. So here our opponent is able to take off the last durability of Voice of Winter. That's really powerful, and that lets them summon their Visca. Now we were able to summon our Karlstrad, so that is a big plus for us. And so here I summon Focus Prayer. Actually, this turn I was planning on summoning either Augmenting Golem or maybe playing Shadowbolt, but as soon as I drew into this Voice of Winter, I totally changed my turn's plan because I want to play this as soon as possible and just delay the opponent as much as I can. This is a late game deck. We're going to win in the late game, and so playing Voice of Winter whenever you can is great. And that's actually why it's usually good to draw cards and then play your cards. So if you're going to draw cards during that turn, it's always better to draw early, and then you can change your plan if something changes. And that's a big mistake that I often see newer players make, is they will play their cards and then draw later, and then on the off chance that they drew something they wanted to play, well, now they can't play it because they already played cards before. So it's a very small thing, but that can come into but that can matter sometimes. Here I go ahead and attack face. The reason I don't kill the Tainted Oracle, and maybe this was a mistake, maybe it wasn't, is because I didn't want my opponent to draw cards on that turn. I'm hoping my opponent kind of bricks, doesn't have Focused Prayer, and doesn't find the cards he needs. And so that's why I don't want to kill the Tainted Oracle right then. This does mean, though, on this turn, when Tainted Oracle unfreezes, I kind of have to make a really tough decision because I, again, don't want to lose the durability on Voice of Winter. So I decide to kill Tainted Oracle on this turn. Arguably, I could have killed it last turn and maybe had some more resources and not played Shadowbolt and played some other cards. So arguably a mistake depending on what my opponent would have drawn if I had killed Tainted Oracle. Here, we're back to 1 durability on Voice of Winter, which kind of really sucks. In this situation, I actually go ahead and I play Snow Sapphire instead of replaying the Voice of Winter over it. Our opponent has a lot of weapons, and Snow Sapphire is in the deck to counter weapons. So that's the sole reason we run Snow Sapphire. Any enemy that's running weapons is going to get countered by Snow Sapphire, like Baduru and other weapon heroes, even stuff like Gwen, is going to get frozen in their tracks when you play Snow Sapphire. It's a 6-cost armor, which is expensive, but it does really help the weapon hero matchup. Okay. So, that last turn while I was chatting about Snow Sapphire, I actually did a lot of things. So, essentially, what I did is I summoned all these Scrapyard Recyclers with Augmenting Golem and Karlstrad and just dealt a ton of damage because I want to make a huge push right now. Usually, you want to time your pushes against priests when your opponent has allies out. So, right now, my opponent has a 5 attack, 7 health ally out. It's going to be kind of painful if my opponent chooses to Tidal Wave here, because if my opponent Tidal Waves, he's going to lose this 5 attack, 7 health ally. And so that's usually when you want to make your big push to deal a lot of damage, when your opponent has allies out and it's going to be really painful for them to Tidal. It's even better that it's frozen because we can basically ignore it for a while and not face NLE penalties for ignoring it. So I fully expect my opponent to Tidal here, but I've got another Karlstrad in hand, I've got Augmenting Golem, and also a Scrapyard Recycler on the board, so I can just reestablish my board on the very next turn if I choose to. I decide not to go in with Karlstrad right away, because I realize that this is a great opportunity to play Voice of Winter. So we can play a little patiently. It looks like our opponent doesn't have, anything on the board, and so we're able to play patiently. And the other reason we can play patiently is because of Karlstrad. And I didn't fully explain why we're running Karlstrad. It does seem a little bit weird in the deck, but it's because of this effect that it can't be frozen. So because Karlstrad can't be frozen, it actually is perfect in this deck with Voice of Winter, because we can just play it right now, even though our opponent is getting frozen, we aren't getting frozen because Karlstrad straight up ignores the freeze. So because of that, we have a huge threat that we can play with basic impunity, even if our opponent is, an ally-based deck. Karlstrad just completely ignores that. Now, our opponent is forced to retreat the Karlstrad, but we're just going to play it one more time. And, basically, there's very few decks that can deal with Karlstrad because it also ignores Disable. So you have to retreat it, or you have to kill it with, some sort of ability, but on 8 health, it's very hard to do that. I did want to mention one more thing, which is all these haste allies are countered by Voice of Winter. So if you see a meta where there's a lot of haste decks, a great example is the Deadman Breach Aramia Outlaw deck. Voice of Winter is usually the best kind of counter to those style of decks. And we can see here our opponent has 2 haste allies that would have been potentially able to deal with Karlstrad, but they can't because they're frozen from Voice of Winter. So I know everyone gravitates towards Braxtonarian Soldier, which makes all opposing allies lose health, and also Towering Brute as haste counters, but I actually think Voice of Winter is one of the best, if not the best haste counter, just by virtue of being able to freeze allies, and then even if they have haste, they can't attack because they're frozen. Anyway, we're actually going to go in for the kill here. I realize that we can just take game here. Actually, I am a little lucky, and I draw into Scrapyard Recycler, which makes it exact game this turn, but had I not drawn into it, I think we would have still had game on the next turn. And you can see how Karlstrad's other ability, which is +1 attack for every other friendly ally in play, can actually make it a huge threat. So we're not just running it because it can't be frozen, but because it gains so much attack through its ability that if your opponent can't deal with it, which a lot of decks can't deal with it, it's going to kill your opponent single-handedly. And so Karlstrad is the main win condition of this deck. The other win condition would be milling the opponent out, which you do in some slower matchups and some other decks. But if you can stick a Karlstrad and then spam all your artifacts, you can make this guy extremely big very quickly. And so here, all of a sudden, out of nowhere, we're able to take out our opponent with just Karlstrad dealing 10 damage. So, yeah, that was a kind of a long match, I would say, and a lot of my other games have been really long as well, but this deck has been doing extremely well for me. I think I've done well against Reika, which was a Rush deck, so this deck can beat Rush by virtue of Nishaven. Praxis is another very aggressive deck that this deck can beat because of Nishaven again, and we can even beat the grind games like Xana. This deck is great against those grindy decks because we are also a grindy deck, and so we're not going to necessarily lose to those grinds as easily. I think probably the biggest weakness of this deck is going to be something like Baduru, and if you don't find the right cards at the right time, or if Baduru can summon like a very early mercenary, this deck can really struggle, especially against resource destruction. We never want to see resource destruction because we need to get to 5 resources for our Voice of Winter. And so any kind of Baduru, or especially a resource destruction Baduru, is going to be this deck's nemesis. So keep that in mind if you plan to play this deck. Maybe you might want to change some things to be even more anti-Baduru if you see a lot of Badurus. Maybe run some more Snow Sapphires. That would be the best option for that. But anyway, this is the deck list. Now, we're only running 3 Karlstrad because it can brick a little bit, and it's also unique. So if you have 3 or 4 copies in your hand, it's totally dead. You can only play one of them. And so that's why we're only running 3, even though it is the win condition of the deck. Now, we do run the Meltdown Thoughtful Investment engine. We're only on 40 cards because we want to see Voice of Winter as soon as possible. And so this is the type of deck that I think is well suited to a 40-card deck. When you want to see one card that is like the thing the entire deck is built around, and you can't seek it and you can't search it in any way, you want to keep your deck size low so that you're always seeing it every game. Because of the Meltdown engine, I'm actually playing 4 Tome of Knowledge. Now, I would recommend 3 Tome of Knowledge for most mage decks, because it also bricks. You can only have one of them out. If you have multiple in your hand, you can only play one of them, so Tome of Knowledge is a good 3 of. But because we have Meltdown, I think that calculation changes a little bit, and we can get a little bit greedier and play 4 Tome of Knowledge because of Meltdown. And there's another reason we can play 4 Tome of Knowledge. It's because of Mending Golem. Mending Golem lets you discard extra copies of items. So this is a great card also to survive weapon decks or any kind of rush deck because it heals you too when you discard an item. So this is a great card to play for just 4 health, and you can discard cards that you don't really need with this. So I already explained Snow Sapphire. I had more Transporting Golem. If I could find the space for it, I would definitely run more. It's a great card. It's really hard to find space when we're trying to do a 40-card deck. Living Ice Wall is amazing against certain matchups like Zaladar and Banebow. It's going to soak up the damage that would otherwise go to other allies and make it really hard for something like Zaladar to play Mind Control on top of your Karlstrad. So Living Ice Wall is really good in some matchups. In other matchups, it's just decent. It's not like amazing. So that's why we only run 2. Thoughtful Investment is another 4 of because we do want to accelerate to our Voice of Winter. If we can get Thoughtful Investment on turn 3 and play Voice of Winter on turn 4, that's really, really nice. But even if we can't do that, even on like a turn 4 or turn 5, accelerating to our late game where we have Snow Sapphire, Karlstrad, and just a lot of 6-cost stuff that we want to be playing is really good. It's also great because we're running Tome of Knowledge. So this is the type of deck that wants to go to 8, 9, 10 resources and then Tome of Knowledge every turn as our main draw engine. And so getting high resources early pays off huge dividends in the long run in this style of deck. The last card that wasn't showcased as much but is really important to the deck is called Scrapyard Recycler. This is the card that makes us also able to run 40 cards. If you don't run this card, you're going to deck out too often. We're a very late game deck. You know, we're not going to be winning early, and so that means we need a way to get cards back into the deck. And Scrapyard Recycler is the way to do it. At the end of every turn, the bottom artifact in your graveyard gets shuffled into your deck. That replenishes your deck size and makes us really be more like a 50-card deck, even though we are only running 40 cards. So this is a great card that I love to put down early and just have it shuffle back items every single turn, and then our deck is replenished constantly. And that's why we never really feel the need to go over 40 cards in this style of deck. The other thing it does is it's only 2 cost, and it has an ability that lets it become an ally if you have an item in the graveyard. So this is great because Karlstrad wants to see allies, but also gets around Voice of Winter, and it's the cheapest item that becomes an ally out of all the artifacts we're running. So something like Mending Golem is nice because it gets Shroud, but it is 3 cost and 2 discards for a 3/3. And same with Augmenting Golem, it's 1 Shadow Energy for effectively a 4/3. And Transporting Golem 2 is 3 cost. So it's the cheapest way to put a body on the board. And so that comes into play very frequently as well, as just a really efficient ally to just put out there. So that's the deck list. I hope that explanation kind of explained the deck. It's a very single strategy kind of thing. You play Voice of Winter and hope your opponent can't counter it. I think Item Destruction works well against Voice of Winter, so if you're playing against an Item Destruction deck, maybe you keep every copy of Voice of Winter. The thing about Item Destruction is that you can destroy the item, but then that costs resources. So then you can just replay the Voice of Winter on the next turn. And so even something like Lance, which would seem like a really bad matchup, is not necessarily unwinnable, because even if they stop Thief you can just play another Voice of Winter on top of it. And then Voice of Winter totally counters Lance's ability, which is great. So yeah, it's a very solid deck. I would say if people know about it, it's gonna be easy to counter, because you can run Item Destruction, and you can run allies that aren't able to be frozen. You can run allies that enter play. You can just run a deck that doesn't use haste and just doesn't care. You can run a weapon hero. So this is the best kind of deck as an anti-meta pick. If you're looking for something to counter a meta where there's a lot of haste, this is the perfect deck for that. If you're looking to counter a very ally-based meta, this is also the deck for that. So it's perfect in that anti-meta position. It's not the kind of deck that's probably going to overtake the meta, because it's all about countering those decks that get really greedy with their allies. So I hope that you enjoy this video. Let me know what you think about this deck in the comments below, and thanks for watching, and see you next time.